Hello guys, thank you so much for coming back to watch another video on my channel. But today's video is going to be slightly different. I'm going to be ranking all the Resident Evil titles from the worst to the best, and that's going to be just my personal opinion, so please make sure don't get offended by it. Cannot wait to discuss my list with you guys, and do make sure to watch the whole video to the end. So I'm going to start my video with the Resident Evil 6. And yes, Resident Evil 6 is not the most beloved game out of the series, and for me personally, it's the least favorite Resident Evil title. This was a title which has ruined the Resident Evil franchise for a lot of people. It put a lot of bad taste after playing Resident Evil 6, and that was a reason as to why Capcom has to go back to the basics by reinventing the franchise with Resident Evil 7. Now don't get me wrong, a lot of gamers out there might still enjoy Resident Evil 6, but for me that wasn't a Resident Evil title for me. It just had a Resident Evil 6 name on it with the main characters we know about, but the game itself and the core gameplay mechanics weren't the same, and the game was completely out of tone or out of touch with the main Resident Evil franchise. So much action and so much going on in the game. There was no survival horror elements, the music wasn't even great for me either, and the sequence and the QTEs just killed that game for me, so I personally didn't enjoy Resident Evil 6. Next title which I think is better than Resident Evil 6 is actually Resident Evil 5. To be honest, Resident Evil 5 was the first game which has shifted the genre into a modern action horror game rather than a survival horror game. However, you can still have loads of fun compared to Resident Evil 6 with the Resident Evil 5, especially when you're playing with your friend, if you're not playing with the AI obviously. Resident Evil 5 still have so many redeeming qualities, where you have characters like Albert Wesker, Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine who comes back into this game. However, that still doesn't make the game any better for me, and I think there's so much more they could have done with Resident Evil 5 which they haven't. I personally enjoyed the game just for the story element and wanted to see a closure on Albert Wesker's storyline. So yeah, Resident Evil 5 I think was a better game than Resident Evil 6 was, but still it wasn't one of the favorite Resident Evil games for me out of the whole franchise. Now Resident Evil 0 tried to copy the same sort of mechanics which has been copied into Resident Evil Remaster, which came out on GameCube, and it was going back to the basics of what Resident Evil titles were, which is actually really good, starring Rebecca Chambers, and you had another protagonist in the game. However, the problem with that game was that you had two main protagonists playing at the same time, but you can't play them separately like A and B storyline. However, you play them simultaneously, where you have to do those puzzles and shift characters, which I think was an annoying element for me, which ruined the game for me personally. And the game had the worst item management in the game, where you had a lot of forced backtracking compared to Resident Evil 1 Remaster, which had so many things done better compared to Resident Evil 0. And even the story wasn't the best thing ever, and I was expecting the game to have so much significant effect on Resident Evil 1 storyline, which it doesn't. It's just like more like a backdrop story. So yeah, personally I think the game could have been a lot better than what it was when it was released on GameCube. Resident Evil 1, which is the game which has started this franchise and started this genre, survival horror. Now when this game came out, I didn't get the chance to play it originally. I quite recently played this game, and for me Resident Evil 2 and 3 was what my childhood memories were, but I think going back to playing Resident Evil 1, you get to feel why this game was so important for a lot of gamers out there. It is through and through a survival horror game where you have to do a lot of backtracking, and the game was great at the time when it came out on PlayStation 1. The game had so many backtracking elements, or the item management, which was borrowed from Alone in the Dark, and the game was great when it came out originally on PlayStation 1. However, I'm not gonna lie to you, I've played this game recently and this game hasn't aged well. And let's not even start on the cringy voice acting which has been done on the original game.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
So yeah, personally for me, I think I enjoyed Resident Evil 1, However, it wasn't one of my top tier Resident Evil titles. When Resident Evil 3 Remake was announced, I was super excited for it because I love Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and I love Resident Evil 2 Remake, so I was expecting that remake to be great as Resident Evil 2 Remake was. However, I was disappointed with this game. I actually pre-ordered this game and I was expecting Nemesis to be a stalker enemy, and it was actually scripted throughout the game, which was, I don't know why they choose to do that. And the game length was very short compared to the price you actually paid for Resident Evil 3 Remake. And the puzzles were very simple, the gameplay gore mechanics were actually reduced down compared to Resident Evil 2 Remake, so it was actually a downgrade compared to an upgrade from Resident Evil 2 Remake. However, the game looks stunning, the graphics was amazing, and the story overall, I personally enjoyed it. So for the story reasons and how the game looked, I had a good times. However, I was expecting this to be one of the greatest remakes, which wasn't the case, and that's the reason as to why it's on the bottom of my list. Resident Evil Code Veronica doesn't get as much attention as it deserves from Resident Evil community. And yes, the game didn't age well, the story wasn't the best thing ever, and the voice acting was terrible as well. But Resident Evil Code Veronica was going back to the very basic Resident Evil title. It was like original Resident Evil titles where you do puzzle solving, backtracking, you have mansion to explore, and this was the Resident Evil title which I personally enjoyed quite a bit. I actually played this quite recently, and I would recommend, if anyone wants to play Resident Evil Code Veronica, go play the HD version, which is I think Code Veronica X. You had returning cast of characters like Claire Redfield in the first half, then you had Chris Redfield, then you also had Albert Wesker. So I personally really enjoyed that game, so I think Code Veronica deserve to be on this top list I've got for Resident Evil titles. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, this is actually the game which has bring me to the Resident Evil franchise. This was actually my first Resident Evil title which I actually played on PlayStation 1, and I personally enjoyed this game. The game has done different experiments compared to Resident Evil 1 and 2. You had choices you can make, you had a dodge mechanic, and you had ammo crafting, which is now present into the most recent Resident Evil titles. Now, how can we forget Nemesis, which was a stalker enemy and it chases you throughout the game, and you have the choice to either fight or flight. So I think that was great compared to when the game came out on the original PlayStation 1. And the game lets you explore the Raccoon City, which I personally enjoyed as one of my favorite settings to be in for Resident Evil games. And the game was a bit generous, especially when you had more action and then you had more ammo where you can craft and find. So yes, I personally enjoyed Resident Evil 3 Nemesis compared to a lot of people who has never played Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Now Resident Evil 2 does everything by the books of Resident Evil 1, but it elevated into a bigger setting where you had two main protagonists as Leon and Claire, and this game had the A and B scenario systems where you can play through A scenario, then you can go back and play B scenario. And as I said, it is more horror game compared to an action horror game, so I personally enjoyed it. There is so many elements, so many fond memories I have. And just like Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, it was one of my favorite titles when I originally played it on PlayStation 1. You get to explore RPD Station. The soundtrack was one of the best things of Resident Evil 2, and I still love the music. And even if I play Resident Evil 2 Remake, I'll go back to the classic music. So yeah, if you've never played Resident Evil 2 titles, I would personally recommend you to go back and play that gem, because it is literally one of the best Resident Evil titles out there. Now the next game is going to be actually quite controversial, because a lot of people consider this game to be the best Resident Evil title, and that's Resident Evil 4. Now just to confirm, from this point onward, any Resident Evil title I'm going to mention, these are all top tier, so you can rank them any way you want to. Now Resident Evil 4 was a masterpiece, and when it came out, it actually changed the genre for the Resident Evil franchise. It's an action horror game rather than a survival horror game. The game setting was so good. You had the village which you play through. You had one of the best boss fights ever in the whole Resident Evil franchise. Now this time around, you don't have a rookie cop and you play as a more professional protagonist who can handle guns, and instead of item management through item boxes, you have your own attaché briefcases where you have to still manage your items throughout the game. Then you can upgrade your cases, you can upgrade your weapons, the firepower, you can buy so many different things. The game actually changed the way as how the Resident Evil title used to be, and it was a completely different shift from the original Resident Evil titles. Saying all of that, I enjoy more subtle Resident Evil titles where you have to backtrack quite a lot rather than an action horror, but I still do consider this is one of the best Resident Evil titles out there, and I think this was the reason as to why Resident Evil franchise has existed for this long. Resident Evil Village, I personally love this game. This is like a theme park horror title for me out of the Resident Evil franchise. The snowy gothic setting from the very start to the very end, the game shifts through many different tones and it lets you explore the whole village, which I personally really enjoyed it. This game also has one of the most scariest segments in the whole Resident Evil franchise, and the story of Ethan Winters actually concluded so beautifully towards the very end of the game, so I loved it as compared to a lot of the Resident Evil community out there. It was a more emotional Resident Evil title. It felt personal for Ethan Winter's storyline because he's going to save his daughter, and at the same time you still get to explore the village, and the village itself was so beautifully crafted. You can explore, there was so much exploration, which I personally enjoy, so that is one of the reasons as to why I really enjoy Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil 4 Remake I personally think is better than the original Resident Evil 4 title. It plays very similar to Resident Evil 4 and it took so many elements. However, at the same time the game is very different. It actually expanded the game, especially the village section, which was the best part of the original Resident Evil 4. There's a lot more exploration in the game, there's a lot more survival horror elements compared to the original Resident Evil 4 was, and it actually removed the most annoying element from the original Resident Evil 4, which was Ashley Graham. This character was the most annoying thing about Resident Evil 4. However, they've elevated that and they have improved on this character and the AI and made it more like a companion rather than saving a hostage. And there's so many memorable boss fights for me in this Resident Evil 4 remake, which they have improved on it compared to the original Resident Evil 4. So yeah, I love Resident Evil 4 remake quite a lot, and I think it's one of the best remakes out there. Resident Evil 7 deserves to be in the top tier spot. This game is the reason as to why we have now the best remakes out there in the Resident Evil franchise. This is the game which has actually saved the franchise, reinvented the franchise after the debacle of Resident Evil 6 title. It goes back to the basics but with a brand new settings. In Bayou, and you had the same survival horror elements, but you had literally one of the best stalkers in the Resident Evil franchise in the form of a Jack Baker. The game was disgusting, filthy, with a brand new enemy compared to the zombies, and the whole aesthetics of that game was literally one of the best for me. And the game was actually inspired from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Evil Dead, which is literally one of the best things ever for me, and I love those movies. So I personally really enjoyed how the Resident Evil 7 was, even though the game was short compared to the other Resident Evil titles were. And yes, we know there wasn't much enemy variety in the game apart from Molded and the main antagonist. However, that game was beautifully crafted and made with so much love and passion, which you can see throughout the game. So yeah, I personally think Resident Evil 7 deserved to be on the top list of Resident Evil titles. Resident Evil 1 Remaster or Remake is literally the best original Resident Evil title to this date. This game has so much mystery and has improved on the predecessor. This is the best tank control Resident Evil title, and it has captured the beautifully crafted mansion with the perfect atmosphere. It improved on every single element compared to the original Resident Evil 1 was. You had the beautiful mansion, you had extra story elements, the voice acting was changed, you had new NPCs in the form of Lisa Trevor. Now this time around, this game was more grim and more dark compared to the original Resident Evil 1 was. The game still had the backtracking, item management, and it literally has one of the best puzzles in the whole franchise. It added so many new features where you can burn the corpses, and if you don't, they turn into crimson heads, which literally is one of the most scary enemies in the whole Resident Evil franchise. Yeah, that game is a masterpiece. There's so much replayability because I've actually finished that game about 20 times already. The best Resident Evil title for me is Resident Evil 2 Remake. This game is literally the perfection for me. The game literally goes back to the true survival Resident Evil title, however it modernizes for a lot of new gamers out there. This game literally had the best stalker in the whole Resident Evil franchise, with the case of Mr. X, who constantly chases you throughout the RPD station. The acting and the voice acting was amazing, the gameplay was outstanding, and the graphics was literally one of the best. So I think that game was literally the perfection for me. And if anyone asked me the gold standard Resident Evil title, I would say Resident Evil 2 Remake. This game literally captures so many things for me and literally is one of the best games out there. So what do you guys think? That was my list from the worst to the best of Resident Evil titles. So please do let me know in the comment section as to what your list is of the top tier Resident Evil titles. I would personally love to read it. So that's it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching this whole video if you have, and I will catch you guys again with another video on my channel. So until then, look after yourself, have a good one.